Hello, welcome to the Mystic Rocket podcast. My name is Belle. I am someone who is really interested in spirituality and a soulful path of living. I'm really fascinated by different far out supernatural ideas. So, the whole concept of the Mystic Rocket podcast is to provide supernatural ideas to fuel your path. And I had to get a little bit caffeinated to do this podcast. This is episode 1, so I was a little nervous. I was trying to get the podcast going in a certain way, so I'll just have to wing it and see what happens. So the very first podcast topic was planned to be exorcism, but some new information came to light about some of the modern day practices of exorcism. And it turns out it's a very dangerous topic because in some religiously extreme cases, people can get hurt or even killed because of dangerous practices that shouldn't be done. So the topic today is the spirit realm and protection. When I think of spirituality, I'm thinking of using a foundation of science and in a clear-headed way, in a balanced and grounded way, only adding spiritual beliefs past that idea of science, like post-science rather than pre-science. So it's really important to me that everyone stays healthy and grounded with a sense of well-being, a sense of being able to navigate daily life in a really cool way. So that's why I didn't want to use the term exorcism in the podcast title, because even though it's kind of about that still, obviously I only support really healthy, good spiritual practices. And I don't know, it gets kind of weird to try to think about, I don't want to, it brings us to one of the first questions we have about the spiritual realm and the idea of exorcism, or the idea of spiritual protection being needed. And that is the idea that should we just avoid the topic in general because it's so creepy. And I think overall I would say we should definitely avoid the practice of exorcism. It seems like it's obviously it's very dangerous, especially when people have religiously extreme ideas. So that really made me think, it really made me take a step back and be like, wow, like what is the way that spiritual beliefs can serve my life and the lives of others, and how can spiritual beliefs undermine our lives in different other ways if we don't have a foundation of science. So all these things, these questions are these open questions, just in terms of like how we'll stay healthy and have some spiritual beliefs. This other aspect of the podcast comes up that I want to go into. All of the ideas in the podcast today are these cool mystical ideas that have caught my attention and sparked my thinking and imagination. My hope is that the listeners will get some inspiration and take away a few ideas and, go and read and figure out your own spiritual path, beliefs, and ways that are really healthy and really serve you well. Obviously, I'm a passionate person who loves the mystical and the spiritual, but at the same time, I'm a relative newcomer. I'm not an expert in any way. So this podcast is from the perspective of me, someone who is passionate about these topics, but I'm still learning so much all the time. I hope you always think for yourself, and, I hope you disagree with me on some things and just keep your own open mind. Just, it's about... Who's the speaker who says living your best life? Is that Hay House or something? So it's about living your best life. Like, what spiritual ideas lift us up and can help us really, in a real way, live our best lives. So I'm going to be mentioning some different things that I've read or different things I've heard from different spiritual speakers. So I really recommend that you go and check out the original books or whatever the form of media is if you want to delve into that topic by a certain author or something like that. If you want to look at those ideas even more, I really recommend that you check out those sources that I'm going to be mentioning. So one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is because I feel like overall it's really good to have an open mind and to keep expanding our consciousness in different ways, and just, kind of basically chewing on different ideas, kind of mulling over, just like being contemplative about different new ideas is actually a huge aspect of my mystical life path. And in my experience, it's really important to keep expanding our minds with these new ideas. So it kind of is interesting, okay, because it brings up, everyone puts down the idea of the armchair philosopher. But I kind of disagree. Like, I understand that actual spiritual practices and meditation are a very important part of the spiritual path. But I disagree that the armchair philosopher is always a bad idea, because I think we can gain a lot through exposing ourselves to new ideas and things that are mind expanding, which often come in the form of, reading other people's accounts, hearing other people's experiences through books or audio or something like that. As I reference different writers or spiritual speakers, of course, all of the conclusions I've drawn and all of the opinions I mentioned are mine, so they don't reflect at all on whatever the viewpoint is of the author mentioned. I'm looking forward to maybe doing some interviews in the future, and I do always think it's important to go back to those original sources. Let's just jump into these topics of the spirit realm, protection, different practices. When I originally wanted to talk about the idea of exorcism, I was thinking of it as a really mild thing, like just kind of like a light thing that went a little bit beyond spiritual protection. So when I mention exorcism, that's the way that I'm approaching it. I'm not approaching it in a literal way that's dangerous. I'm approaching it as more of a thoughtful way, like how we would, almost more like a banishing ritual. Like, how would we banish something negative from our space? So maybe that's not a full-fledged exorcism. So that's why I'm probably going to be using the word protection, spiritual protection more. Okay, so when I was originally drawn to this topic of spiritual protection, I was really, really interested in the topic, and I really knew I wanted to do it for the first podcast. But I was also hesitant because the whole idea of protection from the spiritual realm, from the spirit realm rather, is a creepy idea. Because I think we either grow up thinking there's no such thing as ghosts, or we grow up thinking there could be such thing as paranormal things like ghosts. But in either case, I think that we see different movies and stuff, and usually the supernatural is portrayed in a negative light. So I think that is something that is too bad. Like, it's kind of a hindrance to the spiritual path in many ways, because I think there's something very positive about having an open mind and an open imagination. The positive part to me is that when I'm able to have my own sense of my imagination, there's so much that can come to light. There's so much limitlessness and so much possibility. I could have different lucid dream practices where I could really experience life in a new way that might really inspire me, and I could integrate that into my daily life to live in a more optimistic way. So that's the positive side of being open to the idea of the spirit realm, that there's more to life than just kind of this matrix of going to the office each day and coming home and being exhausted and doing the same thing for years. So I think the possibilities are open wide when we consider the spiritual path, and that's what I love about it. The only downside would be, okay, well, we've opened up this Pandora's box and we've gotten the good parts of the spirit realm, but maybe there's also some things that we need to protect ourselves from. So that's why I think people get a little sense of being hesitant to approach the idea of spiritual protection and feel a little sense of it being creepy. The idea of a spirit world or a spirit realm in general, I wouldn't consider a mainstream idea in terms of American mainstream, but I couldn't be wrong, because there's tons of places in the world where the spirit realm is taken very seriously. There's tons of people who believe in different aspects of the spirit realm and different ways that people interact with a broader sense of life than we have in the American mainstream. So I think the thing that really gets people is when you start to open up your psychic senses and you begin to have your own personal experiences with noticing a little glimmer of something, like seeing an orb, for example. One time I was working with a deck of oracle cards that was based on the fairy realm. And that was the very first time that I saw an orb with my naked eye. Was right after I had been working for a long time. I spent like over an hour reading the book and doing an oracle card reading about fairies. And then I saw an orb. This was a couple of years ago in 2016 or 2017. I took a drink of water, and on the edge of my glass with my naked eye for a pretty long time, I could see this orb. So different things like that are very positive, we get a glimmer of that. It's kind of mind expanding. So I think that's one of the reasons we would be more interested in these topics about the spirit realm, because as we begin to have those personal experiences, we're kind of trying to get more information and learn more so that we'll have more of a sense of what's possible. Not just what's possible, but what's quote unquote normal. Like how many other people around the world are having similar psychic and spiritual experiences. And it turns out, I should look this up, I think most people around the world believe in different spiritual things and have even had their own first-hand experiences, because it's actually a part of life that we've gotten away from, but it's actually still a huge part of life. So one way of thinking about the spirit realm is that there is an astral plane that overlays our earthly plane of reality. So that's one way that we might find ourselves interacting with the spirit realm, is we might notice like, oh, there's something that I'm aware of in my perception, but it's not physically here, and yet it is here. So I think that's where I think of it as the astral plane overlaying our physical realm. That's how that would work to me. And then if you read different things about the astral plane, you read that there is a lower astral. Most people talk about if they're writing about the astral realm. So the lower astral is where we might come across like things that are not as fun, things that we don't want to run into. It kind of represents the negative side of life. When we talk about the astral plane and then the lower astral, that's what brings up this idea about the need for spiritual protection. One of the very first times I heard about the reality of spiritual protection being necessary and some type of spiritual banishment being necessary was back around 2010. I was reading a book by DJ Conway. She writes a lot of interesting pagan books. DJ Conway mentions that she and a friend of hers had to do a spirit banishment type ritual because one of their friends had stayed in too close of contact with someone who had passed over. And the way she described everything, she said it in this realistic, first-hand experience way. And I really just believe people's spiritual experiences. It's one of the ways that I like to stay open-minded, is that I take people's spiritual accounts seriously as much as I possibly can. And so that was just really eye-opening to me that she described or mentioned needing to do a ritual of spirit banishment. And that was one of the first times I started to take note of it. So I think when we look at the creepiness of spiritual protection, we kind of think about like scary movies, and I would consider that the Catholic perspective. And I think in Christianity and Catholicism, there's this idea of extreme duality where it's good versus evil, a very black and white perspective. And like I already mentioned at the beginning, if we get into too much religious extremism, there can be very dangerous practices that everyone should stay away from. It's a really terrible topic. Interestingly, in New Age beliefs, there are like milder spiritual protection ideas. So it's nothing like the scary movies or the extreme religious practices. In fact, I recently have been listening to an e-course from someone who teaches hypnosis. So I looked at this e-course on the Udemy website. It's a hypnosis course by Mark Beale, if you want to check it out. And it's called a spirit releasement e-course. So I think this could be considered a type of spiritual protection and spiritual banishment, or spirit banishment. And it's a world away from the old school scary movies. The biggest difference that the instructor on this spirit releasement e-course describes is that he recommends just staying calm and, for the most part, treating spirit releasement like a regular hypnosis session. It's along the lines, the practices are along the lines of the quote-unquote go towards the light idea, where if there's some type of spirit that's bothering you, you would kind of think of the idea of Archangel Michael or God and kind of say, like, go towards the light, like, don't stick around here and bother me, just go towards something bigger that's I guess the idea is just that it's like more loving. You're saying like, okay, there's something that's kind of negative that's bothering me, so you just want to kind of send it on towards a loving universe that can take care of it. So that opens up a lot of questions right there, doesn't it? Like, so do we need to believe in God to believe in a sense of the spirit realm? Often it seems like it, but that's a sticky subject for me. I'd like to have the option of believing in God or not believing in God. But when we get to the sense of spirituality and the spirit realm, it seems almost impossible to leave out the idea of God. So that's something that I have a kind of an issue with, and it's something I'm still contemplating in different ways. Anyway, so let's get back to the spirit releasement e-course. It's a world away from scary movies, and it's just staying calm and an official methodology for telling a spirit to go towards the light. I do recommend checking out this spirit releasement e-course by Mark Beale on Udemy. It's really interesting. So there's another e-course from Udemy that's on mediumship, and it has this kind of classic idea that you'll run across in a lot of New Age and spiritual literature, quote unquote, healing with an earthbound spirit, and different practices. And this one in particular There are a series of different angels that she recommends you call on to guide a spirit towards the light. And like I just said, like you run into this like so much when you're reading books about mediumship or spiritual practices. Author and spiritual practitioner Cindy Dale, I believe, is one of the people who I've read who mentions different practices like this about like spirit protection, spirit banishment. I recommend The Intense Spiritual and Magical Books by Josephine McCarthy. She has a book specifically about her firsthand experience doing exorcisms. She mentions that a sense of humor is necessary because you don't want to be intimidated by anything. You have to keep a sense of humor. She also mentions that she uses something called a knot technique. It's so interesting because it reminds me of the Chinese movie Kung Fu Hustle, where an exorcist uses an intricate knot to trap a spirit. So this is a case of fiction reflecting reality and vice versa. These kind of shared ideas, like what do we put into the reality camp and what do we put into the fictional camp, and how do they go hand in hand together? So that's wild to me. I grew up not believing in ghosts or anything whatsoever. I wasn't even taught to believe in angels or ghosts or anything like that. So to read this firsthand account of Josephine McCarthy as an exorcist and then notice these similarities between some things she mentions and like some different movies, like that's really wild to me. And she also mentions that negative spirits can sometimes be very cunning and crafty, and then you have to be really cautious. So that was like really kind of a creepy factor to me. So I recommend going and checking out Josephine McCarthy's books. You can easily see them online to order. She's like really, really interesting. There's so many details that she mentions about the magical path that I haven't heard anywhere else. Another way you can see that spiritual practices and spirit realm practices are still happening. So you can just go into your local Barnes & Noble, and in the spiritual and new age section, I ran across a book that I have not read yet called Sister of Darkness, The Chronicles of a Modern Exorcist by R.H. Stavis. So just another example of how these spirit realm practices are sticking around for many people in different ways. So a few months ago, I was listening to a podcast called The Higher Side Chats. And this was a podcast from March 15th, 2020. And in this podcast, the person was interviewing Lon Milo Duquette. And it was a really interesting interview. I really recommend checking out the Higher Side Chats podcast. So Lon Milo Duquette tells this really fascinating story about how he was hired to check out a Catholic school at night, and how it was kind of creepy, but he was able to do his magical practices there. And he also mentions that his own spiritual imagery kind of kicked in for the practices he was doing at this Catholic school at night. So I can't do the story justice, obviously, so I recommend you check out that Higher Side Chats podcast from March 15th, 2020. I found it on YouTube. Okay, so now let's move on to quote-unquote the voodoo perspective. I hesitate to use the word voodoo because I know in many ways it's not the right term, and people use voodoo to refer to a lot of different spiritual traditions that would rather be called something else. So that's something to look into further. But there's this interesting book. Well, first I wanted to mention about voodoo. There is the concept of spirit possession in the voodoo traditions, and it's a practice that they do in a positive way. It's part of how they would interact with the spirit realm. So there's a book about spirit possession called Drawing Down the Spirits, The Traditions and Techniques of Spirit Possession, and it's by Kines Falan and Raven Caldera. And interestingly, if you look at this book or other books about the voodoo tradition, there's an important part of spirit possession, obviously, would be the relationship built up with a particular spirit, and the relationship is built up with mutual trust. This is reminiscent of some cultures who practice shamanism. So it's a sense of spirit possession as being an area of expertise in voodoo or shamanic cultures. And so obviously, like, it's something that's very that I'm not trained as a voodoo or shamanic practitioner, and so I would never attempt to make contact with the spirit realm without guidance. I would have to become an apprentice, I think, of a specific tradition in order to learn spirit possession, if that was something I was interested in, because it's an area of very detailed expertise. So it's very fascinating to me, but probably not something I'll be pursuing because it's pretty hardcore. So as a tangent off of this idea, I already mentioned that I hesitate to even use the term voodoo because I need to research more the specific traditions with specific names and how those traditions have their own practices. And there's also a lot of controversy over the idea of an indigenous shaman versus the more contemporary shamanic practitioner, because a lot of people can be trained almost online or just kind of more casually as a shamanic practitioner, as a modern day American. But there's a lot of controversy because obviously, is that the same thing as an indigenous shaman who has trained like probably almost their whole life to be a shaman? Like, no, it's not the same thing. So I think it's something that we need to be aware of, because we need to be respect the original indigenous shamanic traditions. It's interesting because I think we can benefit from some practices that are inspired by the original shamanism, but are we ever going to have that real connection and that intense or really kind of tangible relationship with the spirit world? As a modern day American, or wherever I'm from, am I ever going to be able to have that relationship with the spirit realm today that the indigenous shamans have had in the past or have currently? It's a really big question. I don't think there's an easy answer other than obviously to be respectful of everyone's traditions. But I was trying to say, like, obviously we can benefit from some practices that are inspired by shamanism, but it's probably never going to be the real indigenous shamanism unless we literally go and travel to other parts of the world and get trained by real shamans. And even then, I feel like it's going to be different when we translate that, or we bring it back to contemporary society, or what we consider mainstream society as an American or whoever we are. Anyway, it's a really big topic, and I think there's no complete resolution other than tremendous respect. And I think we just need to keep having a dialogue about how difficult this topic is, because we can all benefit from some shamanically inspired practices, but at the same time, it's like even that is basically cultural appropriation. So I don't know. It's really a weird question and a huge kind of difficult question. So now we come to the topic of, now that we've gone through a few examples, is it okay that the topic of spiritual protection is shrouded in fear and some or a lot avoidance? Or is it better to become more comfortable with the idea of the spirit realm? And do we have, if we have greater knowledge about the spirit realm, we would be less likely to be intimidated by any type of spirit or any interaction with the spirit realm. So, like, what's better? Should we just avoid it altogether, like many modern people do? Or should we try to interact with the spirit realm cautiously? Or should we confidently try to interact with the spirit realm? I mean, the biggest question for some people might be like, why should I even take time to recognize a spirit realm? Does it even exist? So does it exist? Is it scary? Do we need protection? And that brings me back to another DJ Conway book. This one was a book she wrote about astral travel. She says, just like in real life, if you're walking down a city street, you don't stop to talk with everyone you see on the street because you don't know those people. So as you're interacting with the spirit realm, there's some spirits that are going to be more helpful and more benevolent than others. So overall, I would say for many people it would be helpful to have some sense of a spirit realm. For me, the main reason I'm interested in all this is because I don't want to spend my entire life being afraid of death. I do believe in, that our soul or spirit continues in some form after we transition from our current life. So that's the thing that keeps me coming back to spirituality. But overall, if people are interested in the spirit realm, I think we need to keep really strong boundaries. So that's the important thing, just like have a really strong sense of yourself and be really grounded and balanced. And then I guess this kind of goes with this. There's the idea of, should we ignore ideas like ghosts and stuff that we think are negative because there's the idea of ignoring and not quote unquote inviting trouble. I think this is kind of like a manifestation idea, like energy flows where your attention goes. So like if you're focused on a certain topic, would you be inviting it into your experience to some extent? Obviously, I think that's a pretty controversial idea, and there'd be different people having different opinions on that. Thank you so much for listening, and now we continue with the second part of this podcast. Is the idea of if someone's having a real experience, a genuine experience of the spirit realm, or if they need psychiatric or medical attention. So this question comes up in a book called Woman Who Glows in the Dark by Elena Avila. The author is a shaman and a psychologist, and in the book, I haven't really read the book, I was kind of just flipping through it, but she mentions that the people that she has run across who think they need an exorcism are usually, in her opinion, just dissociated from a part of themselves. So if they request an exorcism, it's because they need psychiatric attention, not an actual an actual exorcism. She thinks it is always a mental health issue in her opinion from who she's run across. And going back to the articles I was researching online, this would be the main camp there as well, because especially for people who don't believe in a spirit realm at all, obviously you'd think, okay, this person just needs medical attention. But it's a difficult subject because obviously there are very grounded and sane people who do believe in a spirit realm. But there are also people who have experiences that are, I guess, something that is only, well, I don't know, it kind of brings up the topic of subjective experiences in general. But I think the idea would be what is in the best interests of a person's well-being and what is healthy for a person. So as soon as someone crosses that line and they're having an experience that undermines their well-being and they're in distress, obviously they do need medical attention. But you can see how the difficulty of the subject is in thinking that everyone, even if they experience the spirit realm in a positive way, in perfect health, some people would think even they need medical attention. But so it's kind of a a nuanced subject that requires a lot of thoughtfulness as you approach it. And that brings me to a topic, or to an idea, that for successful spiritual work, I think people who are successful in spirituality are completely grounded and have a strong sense of their own personality. So I think the stereotype of someone who believes in angels and who believes in magic and the spirit realm, the stereotype would be that that person is not grounded, that they have their head in the clouds, and they're obsessed with all this stuff that no one else, or that some people don't understand. But from what I've run across in my reading and what I've listened to, it's the opposite. People who are successful on a spiritual path are incredibly grounded and balanced, and that's a big part of their spiritual practice. And for instance, like people who are mediums and psychics often have a very strong personality, and of course they have to, because they're not going to get pushed around by anything in the spirit realm. And they also use their angels and guides to help them with that. But just like life in general, you need to be grounded and have a good sense of your own boundaries. Okay, so moving on, the next topic is this really cool YouTube show that I like to watch called Thinking Aloud by Jeffrey Mishlove. It's all these really great parapsychology type interviews, and I really recommend checking Thinking Aloud out on YouTube. It's just so much great material. But it was interesting, in one of his interviews, he was interviewing a hypnosis practitioner. And my impression as he was talking to this hypnosis practitioner was that the practitioner was finding things that he considered to be negative entities. He was finding things in his clients, but he was just mirroring something from his own psyche, and just kind of drawing it out. If that makes, hopefully I'm conveying that in a good way. So the idea would be that, okay, I think when it comes to spiritual practices and magical practices, when people are visualizing and trying to manifest things, you have to be really careful what your intention is, and you also have to be careful about your expectations, because you can manifest, it's like the old Jesus idea, seek and you'll find. Like in terms of the malleable universe and mysticism, you can find exactly what you're looking for. So that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this hypnosis practitioner, to me, was finding things supposedly in other people that was actually just a mirror of something deep within himself that he wasn't conscious of. The conclusion to that would be on the side of avoiding the topic of exorcism, because it wouldn't be that helpful in that case. And I do want to mention that my observation about that particular interview has nothing to do with thinking aloud in general, but it just kind of was something I felt watching it, that particular one. So the next topic is the creepy side again. I have not read any H.P. Lovecraft stories, but I have read part of the book H.P. Lovecraft and the Black Magical Tradition, The Master of Horror's Influence on Modern Occultism by John Stedman. It's a really, really interesting book. In Stedman's book, he obviously talks a lot about specific stories of Lovecraft. So one of the Lovecraft stories features some characters, and as Stedman says, there are multiple levels of possession. There's like, you think, I should have written down what the story was, but you think one character is possessed by another character, and that's true, but actually it was even another character who had originally possessed that character. So it's kind of interesting. I think with H.P. Lovecraft's popular stories, I think this shows how people can be repulsed and fascinated by different topics at the same time. It's kind of like a way for us to deal with this kind of gross, negative stuff. And it seems like almost cathartic. Maybe cathartic is a strong word. But yeah, there's something about horror and creepiness that we almost need, at least in fiction, that we need something to express, either to write it or to watch it or to read it. But at the same time, for me, the actual topic of H.P. Lovecraft and his stories brings up weird energy. So now I'm going to share something from a personal account that's pretty interesting and weird. So when I was reading this book by John Stedman about H.P. Lovecraft, I feel a lot of different things in my crown chakra. So as I was reading, the actual topics themselves gave me an icky feeling in my crown chakra, kind of like the energy was evoking something weird for me. And it wasn't completely a negative energy, but at the same time it was kind of like ick. And it wasn't something that was great, and I was already feeling creeped out. So I ended up wearing a baseball cap in the house as I was sitting on the couch reading this book. And I would describe this as not being a superstitious thing, but I wanted it to be symbolic of me having a barrier on my crown chakra. And I share this because I like to be really honest about noticing subtle energies. The past few years, I notice subtle energies more and more in different light ways that are really empowering, and I really enjoy noticing things like that. So my spiritual path is quirky and unique. So I wonder if there are things that you notice in terms of subtle energy, maybe some unique practices or like little tidbits like that from your own life. And here's on while we're on the topic of creepy things, let's delve a little bit more into okay, so it's like, do some people sometimes experience some type of negative entity? And it seems like from what I've read, as you open up your psychic senses, there's a possibility that you will notice more from the spirit realm. And my case in point for this is something that is purely secondhand anecdotal. So, that's great, right? So I was reading an old post from Reddit, and someone had been using spells from this text. I don't know exactly what it's called. It's like one of the Book of Solomon books. It's like a really serious grimoire that people should only use if they are completely trained as a magician and know exactly what they're doing. So this person from Reddit wrote that they had used the Solomon book, and a few days later, first of all, it worked, the spell, and then a few days later, he noticed blood on his hands that had appeared out of nowhere. And I thought that was extremely creepy. And I'm not talented or skilled enough to delve into magic of that kind. What it brings up for me is this idea of the enormous human imagination. I think we can basically manifest just about anything, and we might not manifest it in physical reality, but we can definitely manifest anything if we're including lucid dreams or astral experiences within that sense of the human imagination. So that's a very wide spectrum of possible experiences. And this reminds me, I was reading someone's book about ayahuasca and his experiences with ayahuasca, like someone from like a Western country. And he was writing about his ayahuasca trip, and he had become fearful of spiders. I read this just before I went to bed, and then that night I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, the spiders, because right before I had woken up, I had like basically a lucid dream of spiders all over the ceiling, and it had seemed real, but that was right before I actually woke up. That's happened to me. That type of thing has happened to me a couple of times, where I wake up kind of twice, and it's freaky because anything can happen when you're waking up in a dream. Anyway, so I thought that was really funny, because obviously I had somehow been thinking about that, and my subconscious mind just kind of threw it back at me or something. So after talking about all that, like somewhat that creepy stuff, this brings up again this need for spiritual protection. And the main thing that authors usually mention is that people need to be confident, have a strong sense of themselves, a strong sense of well-being. Okay, along these lines, have a strong sense of well-being and not let any... Okay, so the idea is the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because if you're in the astral realm, you can't be intimidated by anything. Even if it looks really gruesome or frightening, you can't be fearful of it, or you've just given up part of your own power, because obviously everyone has equal inner power, so you can't let anyone push you around. So the first time this idea really struck me in a big way. Okay, so it brings us to the topic of, on the astral plane or in a mystical sense, any being can take on any form that they want to. Like, I look like a 5'5" woman in this physical realm, but if I was in the astral realm, I could be a 10-foot tall blue fairy, and in whatever location or environment I was in, that would be what I look like to other beings. So it's really interesting, because I originally read this idea from a Chick and Tabitha Cicero book. They do these companion writings to the Israel Regardie books. Okay, so what they mentioned, the Ciceros mentioned that, just in passing, but it was fascinating to me, they mentioned that you should always make yourself taller than the other being that you're interacting with when you're traveling out of body. So that was what sparked this idea that we can take on any form, and that we should be super aware of this when we're traveling out of body, because it's kind of one of your inner power things about not being intimidated by anything. You know, like something could present itself to you something really scary, but you have the ability to be just as intimidating if you want to be. And obviously that's probably not what's in your heart, or you want to be more a good person, I guess, I assume. But it's just super interesting to me. As soon as I read that, that was actually like a huge light bulb moment when I read that thing about always making yourself taller than the other being. It still gets me every time. Like, it made me think about everything in the human imagination, in my own imagination. That actual idea made me think about everything differently, because there's a sense of surrealism in the human imagination. So you can really like be or do or go to any location. You can do anything you want, and we're very limited in the physical reality, and we don't access enough of our imagination and dreaming abilities as much as we can at all. And so this sense of flexibility that I love about the human imagination can be applied in many different ways. I think you'll hear in a lot of guided meditations this idea of a hallway of doors, and behind each door you could find any time or place. So I would consider this a creative interface. And if you're using your enormous imagination, the ability to create an interface that could take you anywhere, like an interface of portals, and each one can take you to a specific place, but it can be anything. That's incredible to me, and that opens up so many possibilities. And that's one of the keys to having a limitless experience, is just opening your mind, first of all, and then being able to step forward and to lucid dream and have out-of-body experiences, and to realize that there's much more to us than our physical form. And just to take it even a step further, I've read 2 books where the authors have mentioned that they have successfully teleported, which I thought was wild and like pretty cool. I must admit that I have not teleported yet, but the writers that I'm speaking of are Stuart Wilde and Bruce Goldberg. They write some really interesting spiritual books, and they each mention that they have successfully teleported. So I'm just trying to, at this point, just expand our minds. And this is why I'm into this genre so much, because it's incredible to me and really just opens up everything. Okay, so now let's step back to this idea of spiritual protection. There is a book by T. Thorne Coyle, and the book is called Kissing the Limitless. And one of the main topics of this book is self-possession. And that's a really good idea, because it's about having a strong sense of yourself, thinking clearly, and accessing spiritual wisdom through your inner sense of yourself, not looking outside yourself for your answers. This makes me think of something I was just thinking of like 10 minutes before I started this, about like, if we're all interconnected, and then what we would call divine intelligence is the infinite, deepest part of life in the universe. So my relationship with divine intelligence is very personal to me. And at the same time, there's a spectrum of life. And so my question is it the same thing? Like, is my relationship with myself and my relationship with the universe, in a way, the same thing. One is just much deeper than the other. Like my relationship with my personal self has to do with my day-to-day life, but my relationship with the universe or divine infinite intelligence is ultimately something to do with the relationship with myself too, because it's this gigantic interconnected spectrum of consciousness. So that's something I want to think about more, because I think that's really interesting. Okay, so I didn't have that much to say about Kissing the Limitless, even though it seems like a really cool book. So this other tidbit, well, it's not, okay. It's a horrible introduction for the next part. It's not a tidbit at all. So if you read any books about the magical path and Western magical traditions, or the Western magical tradition, you run across this idea or this ritual called the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. And I'm new to all this, so obviously I've read a lot about this ritual, and I have tried it, and interestingly, it does seem to work. I want to keep trying it and keep experimenting and just seeing what works in different ways. And it's a banishing ritual. You can look it up if you're interested in it. There's tons of versions of it. Not just versions, there's tons of people telling their way of doing it. It's not different. Most of them are almost the same. Tons of people expressing this ritual in different ways online, so you can easily find it. But anyway, so in my experience, it does work. And there's a magical practitioner online who has a website. His name is Jason Louv. And he recommends, quote unquote, do the banishing, well, actually, I'm paraphrasing. He says, do the banishing pentagram ritual without any sense of superstition. So this comes back to the important idea about protection and confidence. That goes hand in hand. You don't want to, you can't do it with superstition, because that's fear-based. You have to be confident, and you can't get obsessed or fixated on the ritual itself. You have to, it's like anything else. Like you can't worry about little things in life where it gets out of hand. So anyway, it just totally makes sense that you would want to do rituals, especially banishing rituals, without a sense of superstition. So I just thought that was really interesting. I'm going to get towards the end now. So I wanted to mention that along the lines of protection, I really enjoy the magical angelic protection books by Ben Woodcroft. They are available on Amazon, and they're really effective and really good. And then it brings up the question, what are angels really? Israel Regardie mentions this in one of his books about his concept of what angels really are. So I think the question is, are energy signatures, are angels just energy signatures that are built up over time by magical practitioners? Or, I mean, that's probably what they are, because it's probably not a personal, I have no idea. I think everyone has a different opinion on whether an angel would have a unique personality, or whether the angel would be a part of consciousness that has been built up over time. I don't know. I think that's a big question. I'm not going to be able to answer that right now. I think a whole topic in and of itself would be, what kind of altered state of consciousness do you have to have, would you need to interact with the spirit realm? That is obviously its own topic. So along the lines of protection, I was in a relaxed state, and I had a spiritual inspiration about spiritual protection and the idea of magnets and then Okay, so this is it's not even a story, but this is, I was relaxing in bed. I was about to go to sleep. And I wanted to keep my crown chakra really clear and in a healthy state. And I had this insight that I should consider the idea of magnets. And I actually felt kind of a magnetic feeling in my crown chakra. And this reminded me of Franz Barden, because he does a lot about magnets and electromagnetic things in relation to magic. The idea of magnets is something I want to play around with more. Perhaps it's an idea to strengthen my personal energetic field. And then it's interesting. So, like, if I'm feeling some type of magnetic feeling in my crown chakra, what does that mean in terms of where that's coming from? Because actually, it's not a literal magnet in my physical reality. Anyway, so that's super interesting. And it did bring me back to the book I have by Franz Barden. And it did get me to read it, the first part again. So that's really good. And so closing that topic and moving on to the next topic. Another spiritual practice I've been trying for spiritual protection is the Hebrew names of God. And that's a big part of the Western magical tradition as well, from what I've read. So I don't know how I feel about the idea of God. So I'm still working that out for myself. But interestingly, the Hebrew names of God are very positive and have a very positive protective effect on my crown chakra and in my energetic field. So that's almost like scientific evidence right there, at least evidence from my personal experience. That's really cool. Okay, so this has been a whirlwind of ideas in this podcast. What I would like to end with is talking about a book called The Practical Psychic Self-Defense Handbook. And this is a book by Robert Bruce. And Robert Bruce is an expert on astral travel. And I really recommend this book he wrote called The Practical Psychic Self-Defense Handbook. And in the beginning of the book, he talks about how he gained experience and had to write the book basically because a lot of people in the New Age community did not have the skills to help him with spiritual protection when he needed it. And so he had to kind of, unfortunately, just figure out what worked as he went, but now he knows more, so he can share it in this book. And to prove his point, years ago I was on Twitter and someone mentioned something that they noticed that was weird energetically, and I wanted to be helpful, so I recommended Robert Bruce's book, this very book that I'm mentioning. The person on Twitter freaked out. He didn't like that he didn't want to even consider the fact that what he had noticed had been negative whatsoever. And he did not appreciate the fact that I had recommended this book. He acted like he wouldn't touch the book with a 10-foot pole. So that just proves Robert Bruce's point that New Agers often just want to turn a blind eye to a real sense of spiritual protection. And also from the book by Robert Bruce, he has this really powerful affirmation that he provides in the book. And the affirmation is about personal power and your sovereignty, your personal sovereignty. And I'm not going to tell you the actual affirmation because I feel like that would be cheating. And it belongs to his book. So just check out the Practical Psychic Self-Defense Handbook. It's on Kindle and as a physical book, I think. But the idea of the affirmation reminds me of the Invictus poem, when the poem says, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." So I think that's really important to remember, because we are, we have a lot of inner power, and we cannot let anything push us around, whether it's in the physical realm or in the astral realm or anything in between. So I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And as a last type of idea, it's interesting to me that in life, it seems like there's this gigantic ecosystem of different beings. Like I've mentioned, having a wide, enormous human imagination and experiencing it in different ways. So life is a gigantic ecosystem in terms of real life that we experience here in the physical realm, and also in terms of the spirit realm. And even though we're interconnected as one gigantic, weird organism, we obviously need to be our own solo, individuated selves, because we are the individual expressions, we are unique facets of life. So in terms of spiritual protection, any negative entities need to recognize their own inner light instead of trying to prey upon the light of others. So it's just really important to remember that you are a special, individuated aspect of life, and you deserve your time here without being pushed around by anything else. So just be confident and know your own inner light and your own inner power. And overall, I think we can enjoy the spiritual path in a positive way. And what we need to do is take some precautions and be aware of what we're experiencing. And for the most part, the spiritual path can be very healthy and fulfilling and add to our sense of well-being and not take away from it at all. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a great first podcast. I really appreciate your time as you listened, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much.